You just leave that out. I can't relate to it at all. So they weren't my own songs, and it doesn't interest me.
But they
Talk
are.
about it.
But they are.
New York City 1966. The nights didn't end, they simply blurred into something more uncertain, more restless, as if the entire city was searching for a new identity and couldn't quite find it. Inside the factory, the walls echoed with voices, laughter, and ambition, but beneath it all was a quiet tension that never fully disappeared. And then she walked in. Nico didn't arrive like a star, and she didn't behave like one either. She didn't greet anyone, didn't try to fit into the room, didn't even seem interested in being noticed, yet somehow everyone noticed her anyway. There was something unsettling about the way she carried herself, calm, distant, almost detached from everything around her, as if she were observing rather than participating. When she began working with the Velvet Underground, her voice didn't blend in. It cut through, cold and unmistakable, refusing to follow the emotional warmth that audiences were used to. It didn't ask for connection, and that was exactly why people couldn't look away. But behind that presence, something more complicated was unfolding. The men who surrounded her, producers, musicians, visionaries, each believed they understood what she was or what she could become. Some saw her as a project, others as a muse, and a few believed they could guide her into something greater. What they failed to recognize was how little influence they truly had, because Nico was never moving in the same direction as anyone else. She existed just slightly outside of reach, close enough to be seen but never fully known. And that distance would become the source of everything that followed. Because as the music grew louder and the relationships grew more intense, the illusion of control began to fall apart. One by one, the people around her would realize the same truth, though none of them were prepared for it. Nico wasn't trying to belong, wasn't trying to be understood, and certainly wasn't trying to be saved. She was already becoming something else entirely, and no one around her knew how to stop it. She was not born Nico. She was born Christa Pefkin on the 16th of October, 1938 in Cologne, Germany, a country still recovering from the scars of war, where identity itself often felt fractured and uncertain. Long before she ever stepped into a recording studio or stood beside the Velvet Underground, her life had already been shaped by instability, displacement, and a quiet sense of detachment that would follow her for decades. Her father disappeared during World War II, under circumstances that were never fully resolved, leaving behind questions that would never be answered. And in the years that followed, Christa grew up in a world where survival mattered more than self-expression, where emotion was something to be hidden rather than shared. By the time she entered her teenage years, her striking appearance set her apart in a completely different way. Tall, blonde, and almost statuesque, she was quickly drawn into the world of modeling, traveling across Europe, and eventually finding herself in Paris, then New York. It was there that the name Nico began to take shape, simple, distant, and strangely fitting for someone who never seemed fully present in any one place. She moved through high-profile circles, appearing in films and fashion shoots, crossing paths with artists, actors, and musicians, yet never fully attaching herself to any one identity. But music was never supposed to be the center of her story, at least not at first. That changed when she entered the orbit of Andy Warhol, a man who saw potential not just in talent but in presence, in image, in the way someone could command attention without saying much at all. Under his influence, Nico was introduced into a new world, one where art, music, and control blurred together. It was through Warhol that she became connected to Lou Reed and the emerging underground scene, a space that would soon define her legacy. Yet even as doors opened, something never quite aligned. Nico didn't approach music with passion in the traditional sense. She approached it with distance, almost as if she were observing herself from the outside. Her voice, deep and unpolished, didn't try to impress, it lingered unsettled and stayed with listeners long after the song ended. And while the world began to recognize her, the people closest to her began to notice something else entirely. She was there, but never fully there. And that quiet distance would soon turn every relationship around her into something far more complicated than anyone expected. Number 5. Lou Reed. When Lou Reed first encountered Nico, it wasn't admiration that defined the moment, it was tension. Reed was already the driving force behind the Velvet Underground, a songwriter with a clear vision, sharp instincts, and very little patience for interference. His music was personal, raw, and deliberately uncompromising. So, when Andy Warhol insisted that Nico be placed front and center, not just as a guest but as a visible part of the band, Reed didn't see opportunity, he saw disruption. At first, the conflict was subtle. Nico was given vocal parts on songs that Reed had written, including tracks that would later define the band's identity. But her voice didn't sound like his world, it sounded like something imposed onto it. Cold where his was emotional, detached where his was intimate. Nico's presence altered the tone in a way Reed never fully accepted. And it wasn't just about the music, it was about control. Reed had built something that felt entirely his, and suddenly, there was someone else standing in the spotlight, someone he hadn't chosen. Nico, for her part, never tried to ease that tension. She didn't adapt to Reed's expectations, didn't soften her delivery, didn't attempt to become what the band needed her to be. If anything, her distance made the situation worse. She performed the song, stood on stage, and fulfilled the role, but she never seemed invested in the structure that Reed was trying to protect. That indifference began to feel like resistance, and for Reed, resistance was something he didn't tolerate for long. Behind the scenes, frustration grew quickly. Reed began pushing back against Warhol's influence, determined to reclaim control over the band's direction. And as that battle intensified, Nico became the clearest symbol of everything he wanted to remove. She wasn't just a collaborator, she was a reminder that the band was no longer entirely his. The breaking point didn't come with a dramatic confrontation. It came quietly, almost inevitably. Nico was pushed out, her role reduced, her presence erased as Reed reasserted control. The band moved forward, but something had already shifted. Because even though she was gone, the tension she introduced didn't disappear. It lingered, embedded in the music and in the relationships that followed. And for Nico, it was just the beginning. Because if Lou Reed saw her as an intrusion, the next man would see her as something very different. Number 4. Andy Warhol. If Lou Reed saw Nico as an intrusion, then Andy Warhol saw her as something else entirely, an idea. And for Warhol, ideas were meant to be shaped, displayed, and controlled. When he brought Nico into his orbit at the factory, it wasn't because of her musical background. It was because of her presence, her stillness, her distance, her refusal to perform emotion in a way that others could easily understand. To Warhol, that wasn't a limitation. It was a kind of perfection. At the factory, everything was curated. People weren't just individuals, they were part of a larger composition, a living installation where image mattered as much as substance. Nico fit into that world with unsettling ease. She didn't need to try, she didn't need to adapt. Her silence became part of the aesthetic, her detachment. But that kind of control came at a cost. Nico wasn't being asked to grow, she was being positioned. Warhol decided where she stood, what she represented, and how she was seen. He gave her visibility, yes, but it was a visibility shaped entirely through his lens. And the more she became associated with his world, the more her identity began to blur into something that wasn't fully her own. At first it worked. The attention, the intrigue, the sense of being part of something new and undefined, it all pulled Nico deeper into Warhol's universe. But over time, the limits of that role became impossible to ignore. She wasn't evolving. She wasn't being understood. She was being displayed. And for someone who already lived at a distance from everything around her, that kind of detachment only grew stronger. Warhol, on the other hand, never saw a problem. From his perspective, Nico was exactly what she needed to be. That disconnect between how she saw herself and how he presented her created a quiet but irreversible fracture. Because while Warhol believed he had given her a place in something important, Nico began to realize that the place he offered wasn't one she could stay in. And when she finally stepped away, it wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. The separation was already there long before anyone acknowledged it. But leaving Warhol's world didn't bring clarity. It only led her into something far more personal and far more destructive. Number 3. Jim Morrison. If Andy Warhol tried to shape her, then Jim Morrison saw something far more unpredictable in Nico, something he didn't want to control but couldn't resist. By the time their paths crossed, Morrison was already becoming a symbol of excess and intensity, the volatile center of the Doors, a man drawn to chaos as much as he was driven by it. And Nico, with her quiet detachment and emotional distance, represented a different kind of mystery, one that didn't explode outward, but pulled everything inward. Their connection wasn't built on stability. It wasn't even built on understanding. It was built on recognition, two people who saw something in each other that others couldn't quite explain. Morrison lived loudly, constantly testing limits, pushing boundaries, daring the world to react. Nico did the opposite. She withdrew, observed, and remained just beyond reach. And somehow, that contrast created a tension that neither of them could ignore. But tension doesn't create balance. It creates friction. And over time, that friction began to take its toll. Morrison's world was fast, chaotic, and often self-destructive. Nico, already distant from everything around her, didn't ground him. She mirrored the instability in a quieter, more internal way. Their interactions became less about connection and more about reflection, each one amplifying the other's tendencies without offering any sense of direction. There were moments, brief, almost fleeting, where it seemed like something real might form between them, but those moments never lasted. Morrison was too unpredictable, too consumed by his own spiral. Nico, in her own way, was just as unreachable. She didn't try to hold on to him, didn't attempt to anchor what they had. And that absence of effort created something even more fragile than conflict. It created inevitability. Because relationships like theirs don't end suddenly. They fade slowly as the weight of everything unsaid begins to settle in. Morrison moved deeper into his own chaos. Nico moved further into her own distance. And whatever existed between them dissolved without resolution, leaving behind only fragments of something that was never fully defined. But if Morrison represented chaos, the next man in Nico's life would represent something else entirely. Something quieter. Something more dangerous. Number 2. Brian Jones. By the time Nico crossed paths with Brian Jones, both of them were already drifting at the edges of something they could no longer control. Jones, once the creative force behind the Rolling Stones, was slowly losing his place within the very group he had built. The power had shifted, the direction had changed, and the man who once defined the band was now becoming an outsider within it. Nico understood that kind of distance better than most because she had been living in it for years. Their connection wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was built on a shared sense of displacement, a quiet recognition that neither of them truly belonged anymore, not in the spaces they once occupied, and not in the versions of themselves the world still expected to see. Jones was unraveling in a way that was visible to everyone around him, his struggles becoming harder to hide as his influence faded. Nico's unraveling was different. It was quieter, less obvious, but no less real. She didn't fight against it. She moved with it. And that difference created something unsettling between them. Jones was searching for control, for relevance, for something to hold on to as everything slipped away. Nico wasn't searching for anything. She wasn't trying to reclaim a place or redefine her role. She simply existed within the decline, observing it without resistance. To Jones, that kind of detachment was both fascinating and impossible to understand. There were moments when it seemed like they might stabilize each other, if only briefly. But those moments never lasted. Jones's world was collapsing too quickly, and Nico offered no structure to slow it down. She didn't intervene. She didn't try to change the direction things were heading. And in that absence, the connection between them became something fragile, something that couldn't survive the weight of what was happening around it. When Jones's life came to an abrupt and tragic end, it marked more than just the loss of a musician. It exposed how far he had fallen from the center of his own story. And for Nico, it was another quiet reminder of something she had already begun to understand. The people around her didn't just change, they disappeared. And yet, even after everything she had seen, the most personal conflict of all was still waiting. Number 1. Alain Delon. Long before New York, before the Velvet Underground, before the voices and the shadows, there was a different world, quieter, more controlled, and far more personal. It was in that world that Nico became involved with Alain Delon, a man whose presence carried a different kind of power. Delon was not part of the underground scene, not part of the experimental chaos that would later define Nico's life. He represented something else entirely: structure, image, and a carefully maintained identity that left little room for uncertainty. At first, their connection seemed almost inevitable. Both were striking, both moved through elite circles, both understood the weight of being seen before being understood. But beneath that surface, the differences between them were already forming cracks. Delon's world relied on control, on maintaining a certain image, a certain narrative. Nico even then didn't fit into narratives easily. She moved unpredictably, emotionally distant, even in moments that demanded closeness. The relationship quickly became complicated not through dramatic conflict but through something quieter and far more difficult to resolve. There were expectations spoken and unspoken about who she should be, how she should behave, and what role she should play. Nico never fully accepted those expectations. She didn't fight them directly. She simply didn't become them. And that refusal created a distance that neither of them could close. When their son Ari was born, the situation became even more fragile. What should have brought clarity instead exposed the fractures that had already been there. Delon denied paternity, stepping away from a responsibility that would remain unresolved for years. Nico, already accustomed to emotional distance, faced something far more personal than anything that had come before. This wasn't about music or image or artistic control. This was about identity, responsibility, and absence. And yet even here, Nico remained consistent, in the only way she knew how. She didn't try to reshape the situation into something stable. She didn't chase resolution. She moved forward, carrying the weight of what had happened, without ever fully addressing it. That silence became part of her story just as much as the music or the people who passed through her life. Because in the end, Alain Delon wasn't just another relationship that failed. He was the moment where everything became real. And once that happened, there was no going back. By the time the noise faded and the lights dimmed, Nico was no longer standing at the center of anything. The scenes that once defined her, the rooms filled with ambition, the voices that once surrounded her, the men who believed they could shape her story had all begun to disappear one by one. What remained wasn't a legacy in the traditional sense. It was something quieter, more difficult to define, and far less understood. She had moved through worlds that most people only witnessed from a distance. She had stood beside figures who would go on to define entire eras, yet she never fully became part of their narratives. And that was the paradox that followed her until the end. Nico was always present, always visible, and yet somehow never fully seen. The conflicts that shaped her life were never resolved in the ways people might expect. There were no clear endings, no final reconciliations, no moments where everything suddenly made sense. Instead, there were fragments, relationships that faded, connections that dissolved, and questions that were never answered. And perhaps that was the point, because Nico never lived a life that could be easily explained. She existed on the edge of everything: fame, identity, connection, never fully stepping into any of it but never completely leaving either. And that distance, that quiet refusal to belong, became the defining thread that tied her entire story together. In the end, the music remained. The voice remained, but the person behind it was always just out of reach. And maybe that's why even now Nico isn't remembered for what she gave to the world. She's remembered for what the world could never quite hold on to.